Imagine an empire so vast that when night fell on its capital, the sun was still shining somewhere within its borders. An empire where a single decision in London could quietly but decisively alter the fate of a village in India, a port in Africa, or a distant island lost in the Pacific. At its peak, this empire ruled nearly a quarter of the world's population and controlled almost a fourth of the Earth's land. It drew borders that still define nations today. It reshaped cultures, languages, and identities across continents. It decided wars before they were fought, economies before they were born, and destinies before people even knew what they were losing. This wasn't ancient Rome, with its legions marching across Europe. This wasn't the Mongol Empire, built on horseback and conquest. This was something different, something modern, something global. This was the British Empire. But just how big was it, really? How did a small island nation on the edge of Europe rise to dominate the world? And what was the true cost of ruling the largest empire in human history? To understand the sheer size of the British Empire, we have to understand its ambition. Because Britain wasn't born powerful. It became powerful over centuries of calculated risk, ruthless competition, and relentless expansion. In its early history, Britain was vulnerable, divided, and often overshadowed by greater European powers. Yet, through ships, trade, war, and strategic patience, Britain slowly transformed itself from a struggling kingdom into the most dominant global force the world had ever seen. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was rarely obvious while it was happening. Instead, it unfolded quietly, port by port, treaty by treaty, conflict by conflict. Britain learned that power didn't always come from direct conquest, but from control of trade routes, oceans, economies, and information. This is the story of how far British power reached, why it grew so large, and why, despite its unimaginable size, it eventually collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Britain was far from the center of global power. Spain and Portugal dominated the oceans, carving out vast overseas empires. France was strong, wealthy, and culturally influential. The Ottoman Empire ruled enormous territories across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Britain, by comparison, was small, with limited resources and surrounded by stronger rivals. Its population was modest, its economy underdeveloped, and its political stability uncertain. Yet, Britain had two crucial advantages that would change everything. The first was geography. As an island nation, Britain was naturally oriented toward the sea. The second was a growing hunger for trade, driven by merchants who saw opportunity beyond Europe. As European powers desperately searched for new trade routes to Asia and new sources of wealth, Britain realized something fundamental. Whoever controlled the oceans would control the flow of goods, money, and power. Naval strength, not land armies, would become the foundation of its empire. British ships began sailing farther than ever before, crossing the Atlantic, rounding the coast of Africa, and pushing into the vast, wealthy markets of Asia. At first, Britain didn't conquer through massive armies. Instead, it conquered through commerce. Chartered companies, most famously the East India Company, were granted extraordinary powers by the Crown. These were not ordinary businesses. They could make treaties with local rulers, raise their own armies, collect taxes, administer justice, and even wage war, all in the name of Britain. What began as simple trading posts slowly evolved into fortified settlements. Forts grew into towns, towns became cities, and cities eventually became colonies. This expansion happened gradually, often unnoticed by the wider world. Britain didn't announce its empire loudly. It built it quietly, piece by piece, until its influence stretched across oceans and continents. By the 18th century, the British Empire had taken a recognizable shape. Britain controlled large territories in North America, the Caribbean, parts of Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. Vast quantities of sugar, cotton, tea, spices, and tobacco flowed into British ports, generating enormous wealth. London grew into a global financial center, and Britain's economy boomed. But empire was never just about money. It was about power, the power to dictate trade terms, to influence politics, and to dominate rivals. As Britain grew richer and stronger, conflict became inevitable. Wars with France and Spain and other European powers were fought not just in Europe, but across the world. Colonies became battlegrounds, and the empire was tested repeatedly. Yet time and again, Britain emerged stronger, learning from each conflict and expanding its reach even further. Then, in 1776, the British Empire faced what many believed would be a fatal blow. 13 colonies in North America rebelled, declaring independence. After a long and costly war, Britain was defeated, and the United States of America was born. This was a humiliating loss, and many observers assumed the British Empire was finished. How could an empire possibly recover after losing such vast and valuable territories? But Britain didn't collapse. Instead, it adapted. Rather than retreating from its global ambitions, it redirected them. Britain turned its focus away from the Americas and toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. This shift marked the beginning of what is often called the Second British Empire, one that would prove even larger, more centralized, and more aggressive than the first. Losing America didn't end British imperial ambition. It refined Italiano. The 19th century became Britain's imperial century. The Industrial Revolution had supercharged the British economy, creating an insatiable demand for raw materials and new markets for finished goods. Steamships and the telegraph shrank the world, allowing London to project its power and control its colonies with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The Royal Navy, unrivaled on the seas, became the global enforcer of British interests. A policy known as Pax Britannica, or British peace. But this peace was often imposed through force. The empire expanded aggressively. In India, the East India Company's rule was replaced by direct British control after the massive rebellion of 1857. In Africa, Britain scrambled with other European powers to carve up the continent, seizing vast territories from Egypt in the north to South Africa. Britain also established colonies in Australia and New Zealand, and its influence spread across Southeast Asia and into China, where it fought the Opium Wars to force open Chinese markets. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire had reached its absolute zenith. It was the largest empire in human history. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," was a literal truth. It governed over 400 million people, a staggering number at the time. From the icy expanse of Canada to the deserts of Australia, from the bustling ports of Hong Kong to the jungles of Africa, the Union Jack flew over a global network of colonies, dominions, and protectorates. This vast empire was not a single, uniform entity. It was a complex patchwork of different systems of rule. Some territories, like Canada and Australia, were settler colonies with a large degree of self-government. Others, like India and much of Africa, were ruled directly by British officials, with little to no local input. The experience of living under British rule varied enormously depending on who you were and where you lived. For some, the empire brought access to British technology, law, and education. It built railways, telegraph lines, and ports that connected previously isolated regions. But for millions more, it brought exploitation, violence, and the destruction of their traditional ways of life. Economies were reoriented to serve Britain's needs. Local industries were suppressed, and resistance was often met with brutal force. The wealth that flowed into London was built on the labor and resources of colonized peoples. The story of the empire's greatness is inseparable from the story of the suffering it caused. So, what brought this colossal structure down? The seeds of its decline were sown, even at its height. The very ideas of liberty and self-determination that Britain championed at home were spreading throughout its empire. Nationalist movements began to grow, demanding independence. The cost of maintaining such a vast military and administrative network was immense, a constant drain on the British treasury. The two world wars delivered the final, fatal blows. Britain emerged victorious from both conflicts, but was financially exhausted and its moral authority was shattered. The wars had shown that Britain was no longer invincible. After World War II, a wave of decolonization swept across the globe. India, the jewel in the crown of the empire, gained its independence in 1947. This triggered a chain reaction. Over the next 2 decades, dozens of colonies across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean demanded and won their freedom. The British Empire didn't end in a single, dramatic collapse. It unraveled, territory by territory, until by the late 20th century, only a few small, scattered overseas territories remained. The age of empire was over. Today, the legacy of the British Empire is all around us. It's in the languages we speak, the borders of countries on a map, the global spread of sports like cricket and soccer, and the complex, often painful histories that connect nations across the world. Understanding the British Empire's ambition, its scale, its achievements, and its atrocities is essential to understanding the world we live in today. It's a reminder of how a small island nation reshaped the globe, for better and for worse, and how even the mightiest empires eventually face their own sunset. How big was the British Empire, really? Big enough to rule a quarter of the planet. But size isn't the whole story. Let's start with the heart of it all. India. For Britain, India wasn't just another colony. It was the jewel in the crown. It provided raw materials, cheap labor, and staggering tax revenues. Hundreds of millions of people were brought under British rule. To control this vast subcontinent, Britain reshaped everything. They built railways, not to help Indians travel, but to move goods and troops efficiently for the empire. They introduced English education to create a class of administrators loyal to them. India's own industries were sidelined to make way for British goods. India literally financed Britain's wars and fueled its industrial might. It was the engine room of the empire. By the late 19th century, with India secured, Britain's ambition turned aggressively towards Africa. This was the infamous scramble for Africa, a frantic race among European powers to carve up the continent. Britain moved fast. It seized Egypt to control the Suez Canal, the vital shortcut to India. It then expanded across East, West, and Southern Africa, grabbing territories that would become Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. Borders were drawn on maps in London and Berlin, straight lines cutting across ancient cultures and communities with zero regard for the people living there. The goal wasn't to govern for the benefit of Africans, but to control resources and strategic points. Britain even dreamed of a continuous strip of territory running from Cape Town all the way to Cairo. Africa became a chessboard for imperial power plays. By 1920, right after World War I, the British Empire reached its absolute peak. The scale is hard to wrap your head around. It covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's entire land, surface that's about 35 million square kilometers. More than 400 million people lived under British rule, which means 1 out of every 4 people on the planet was a subject of the crown. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," wasn't a metaphor. It was literally true. As the sun went down in London, it was rising over Fiji. From the vast plains of Canada to the deserts of Australia, from the shores of the Caribbean to the newly acquired lands in the Middle East, British influence was everywhere. No empire in history, before or since, has ever matched this global reach. Britain had become the world's undisputed superpower, shaping the modern world in its own image. So how did Britain manage to control such a colossal empire? It wasn't just through brute force. The real secret was a clever combination of tactics. They relied heavily on the Royal Navy. It was the most powerful navy in the world, and it was the backbone of the empire. It protected trade routes, enforced blockades, and projected power across every ocean. As long as Britain ruled the waves, its empire was safe. On the ground, they used a strategy of divide and rule, playing different local groups against each other to prevent them from uniting. They also co-opted local elites, giving them power and privilege in exchange for their loyalty. And they made sure that colonial economies were completely dependent on Britain. But maintaining this global system was incredibly expensive and required constant vigilance. The very size that made the empire look so strong was also its greatest weakness. And we have to talk about the human cost. For all the talk of railways and administration, the empire was built on exploitation and suffering. Colonial rule was about one thing: extracting resources for Britain's benefit, often with devastating consequences for local populations. In India, British policies prioritized grain exports over feeding its own people, leading to horrific famines that claimed millions of lives. In Africa, forced labor was common, and those arbitrary borders drawn by Europeans planted the seeds for future conflicts that continue to this day. Even closer to home, in Ireland, British economic control contributed to the catastrophic Great Famine. The grandeur of the empire masked a dark reality of cultural suppression and economic ruin. Unsurprisingly, resentment was simmering everywhere, and soon, the calls for freedom grew too loud to ignore. The World Wars were the beginning of the end. World War I drained the empire of its money and its men. Britain won, but at a tremendous cost. World War II nearly broke it completely. The country emerged victorious, but was economically shattered and deeply in debt. Its moral authority was gone. The very colonies that had sacrificed so much for the war effort now demanded their independence. The myth of British invincibility was broken. It was no longer a question of how to expand the empire, but how much longer it could possibly hold together. The clock was ticking, and the age of empire was drawing to a close. After 1945, the whole structure unraveled with stunning speed. It started with the big one. India gained independence in 1947. This sent a powerful signal across the world. What followed was a wave of decolonization. One by one, nations across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia declared their independence. The empire wasn't dismantled by conquest. It simply collapsed under its own weight. Britain, exhausted and broke, could no longer afford to hold on. Within a couple of decades, the largest empire the world had ever seen was gone. The sun had finally set. Today, the British Empire is a thing of the past. But is it really gone? Its legacy is all around us. The borders that caused conflict in Africa and the Middle East. Many were drawn during the Imperial era. The reason English is a global language, a direct result of the empire. The legal and political systems in countries from Canada to India still bear the imprint of British rule. The empire's shadow stretches across history, shaping our present in ways we often don't even realize. So, how big was the British Empire? It was big enough to reshape the world, to control the destiny of millions, and ultimately, to prove a timeless lesson. No empire, no matter how vast or powerful, can last forever. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from history.